Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology. Hi there.
Hi there.
Today I'm very excited because we're going to share with our listeners the conversation that you had with Father James Martin just a couple of weeks ago.
Which was so awesome. I'm so glad I got the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I'm really happy that we had a chance to chat with him too. I remember the first time that I became acquainted with Father James Martin was on Krista Tippett's podcast On Being, which at least at that time in Nashville, it came on Sunday afternoons on NPR.
Yep.
And I was driving back from church and his voice came on. I was immediately drawn to what he had to say and his very easy to listen to demeanor. Mm-hmm. And I understand why so many people like and respect him so much.
Yeah, so what did you like about him? I mean, I know what I like about him, but what did you like?
Well, it's interesting because at that point, I wasn't aware of his position on LGBTQ plus issues. Mm-hmm. In fact, at that point, I'm not sure how much he had stepped into that spotlight.
Right.
But I was just really interested in just kind of his take on issues of interest to liberal and moderate Christians in general.
Mm-hmm. He comes out of the Jesuit tradition, which I think we talk about a little bit in the interview. And the key to the Catholic history is, first of all, the Roman Catholic Church has been around since Rome was a thing, right? So it's been around forever. And like most things that have been around forever, it's got all kinds of different threads in it. He comes out of the Jesuit tradition,
right,
which is a very educated group, mm-hmm. and has been both on the extremely conservative and extremely liberal sides of Catholicism for a very long time. Not in terms of its sense of what it means to be a Catholic Christian, mm-hmm. but in terms of what it means to be in the world, right?
Right.
So some of the best Catholic poets come out of the Jesuit tradition. Anyway, I knew him first, having nothing to do with LGBTQ stuff, but because of his other books, because of the stuff he did before all of this happened.
Wow, yeah.
And he reminds me actually of an interview we did a few years ago with someone else who had written one time on the LGBTQ issue and then became well known for it. And it's the same thing, I think, with Jim Martin.
Yeah.
Right? Is a lot of people, a lot of our listeners may know who he is or will be glad to know who he is because of this one thing he happened to do. And he's stayed on it. And what I love about him is there's a sweetness to him.
Yes.
That he has not lost. And he maintains even as he takes some pretty controversial and difficult stances.
I agree. Well, it was a great conversation. Really had fun listening through it again. I think our listeners are going to love it. Here's Elane chatting with our friend, Father James Martin.
Tell us who you are and tell our audience why you might be here.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm happy to be here. My name is Father James Martin. You can call me Jim. I'm a Jesuit priest, which is a member of a Catholic religious order. And I work at America Media, which is a Catholic magazine and website. We've been around since 1909. I write a lot of books on all sorts of things. Prayer is my last one. My newest one coming up in September is on Lazarus. And then I also do work with the LGBTQ community, mainly in the Catholic Church. So that's a little quick thumbnail of who I am.
That's awesome. So our listeners tend to not come from historical liturgical churches. This is all new. And when we lead worship, we kind of do what we call liturgy light. So we think about Eucharist as being central as opposed to message being central, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what makes the Catholic Church distinctive?
Yeah, what a great question. You said liturgy, historical, liturgical. What was the term you used? It was such a great term.
Historical and liturgical.
That's great. Well, we're both. We're very historical and very liturgical. So what makes it distinctive? Gosh, well, the Eucharist is really at the center of our worship. We obviously, the Catholic Church has the Pope, so we're under one person. We're under Jesus, of course, who's really the head of all the churches and church. But the Pope, the bishops, so it's very hierarchical. And we believe it traces its way all the way back to St. Peter. Of course, others would disagree, and the Orthodox Church would say they do because we split up in whenever. Gosh, it's also universal. I always say there's Mass going on in Nairobi the same time it's going on in New York, right? So it's a universal church worldwide. Gosh, yeah, it's hard to. I'm usually not asked to define the Catholic Church, but Yeah, I mean, centered around the Eucharist, historical, under the guidance of the Pope, but really under the guidance of Jesus. So, yeah, probably not too different from a lot of the churches that people are listening from.
So you described yourself as Jesuit. Can you explain what that means in terms of the Catholic Church? Because, for example, you could have been Franciscan, you could have been
That's
Dominican.
right. That's harder. Because I think most of your listeners probably know what Catholic is, but maybe not as many know what Jesuit is. So basically, as you said, it is a Catholic religious order for men. There are Catholic religious orders for women. Those would be the Catholic sisters. And it is like in that way the Franciscans, the Benedictines, the Trappists, the Dominicans. Now, what does that mean? It means we take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We live in community. And we do all sorts of different things. So Jesuits are probably best known in the States for their schools. So Georgetown, Boston College, Fordham. The joke is, the Jesuit schools are the ones with the great basketball teams: Gonzaga, Georgetown, Xavier.
But the Franciscans put out the best spread, right?
Or the Trappists, right? Yeah.
Okay.
So there's also, by the way, there's a subset of Trappist, Franciscan, and Jesuit jokes, FYI, within the Catholic Church. So we're known for that, but I think we're also known for our spirituality, which is a very broad-minded spirituality that can be summarized as finding God in all things, which means we also run retreat houses, but we do a million other things. So I work for a Catholic magazine. Some of my friends work in refugee camps. They teach. Gosh, there's social workers. A good friend of mine is a prison chaplain at San Quentin. So then the old joke is, if you've met one Jesuit, you've met one Jesuit. We do lots of different things. There's a guy out in LA you probably heard of called Greg Boyle, who works with Homeboy Industries, who works with former gang members. So and he's a priest. So the Jesuits are, we try to, again, find God in all things and help people find God in all things. So that's a brief summary of the Jesuits. It's a little confusing because religious order priests and brothers, we're still Catholic, and sometimes we help out at parishes. And sometimes we run parishes, the local bishop will ask us. And then to make it even more complicated, which is just baffles people, that the current Pope is a Jesuit. So Pope Francis is a Jesuit. And after years and years of saying, Jesuits don't become popes, he became a Pope. So there you go. Probably the first and last Jesuit Pope.
I think you're probably right about that, that assessment. So one of the reasons we are familiar with you is because you have been, I hate to use the word outspoken, but outspoken. You've been clear, I would say, about
outspoken.
Outspoken about LGBTQ inclusion in the family of God. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a bit more about that for our folks who are largely LGBTQ.
Yeah, so it happened. It's a long story, which I will make short because it is a podcast after all, not a 7-part series. But in 2016, you remember, of course, the Pulse nightclub massacre, where 49 people were killed. I'm sure as most of your listeners remember. I was really struck by the lack of response from the Catholic bishops. It really frustrated me. Very little in terms of condolence or sympathy or even notice. The phrase that kept coming into my mind, I'm sure you have these experiences, the sentence that kept coming into my mind was, even in death, these people are invisible to the Catholic Church. So I did a Facebook video, which led to a talk, which led to a book called Building a Bridge, which led to lots of controversy and, very positive reactions and very negative reactions, which led to this kind of ministry, which I do with lots of people. There's lots of people in the church who do this ministry, which led to, a meeting with the Pope, and then a second meeting with the Pope, and then a conference that we run. We've run 2 years, and it's going on. So it's sort of led me into this ministry, which I really didn't plan on it. I see God's hand in it because I certainly did not sit down and say, I will now run this LGBTQ ministry and I'll start a website and I'll do fundraising. But it's funny. I think there's two ways of kind of going into a ministry. I think you discern it, right? You go on a retreat, you discern it, you think about it, you lay it out. And the other way is you just, you wake up one morning, you say, how did I get here? And at each juncture, I was asking my Jesuit superiors also for permission, because you heard that third vow, obedience. I do have to ask permission, and they gave me permission. And so I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years now. Yeah, it's been interesting to say the least.
I like what you were saying about the way that your ministry takes its shape and
Yeah.
that it is clearly guided by someone other than yourself, you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
And it's funny, there's a great story. What's called our superior general, which is basically the head of the order, was a fellow in the 1960s called Pedro Arrupe, very beloved in Catholic circles. Yeah. So there's a great story like this. Some journalist asked the superior general, so where are the Jesuits going? Like what do the next 10 years or 20 years have in store? What do the Jesuits have in store? And Pedro Arrupe said, I have no idea. And his point was, he followed up. He said, it's up to the Holy Spirit. We don't know what we called to do or what, as it turned out, they ended up working a lot with the refugees and the poor. But that's kind of how I say it. And I say it to people I work with, and sometimes it drives them a little crazy. Like, this is kind of the work of the Spirit, right? I say this to lots of people, not just people in America. Yeah, so we'll see where God takes it and what God wants it to be, right? And where God wants us to go. But I sort of base it on the needs of the LGBTQ people. They let us know what they need by what articles they read, by what they ask for, those kinds of things.
so now that you've been doing this for a few years and you've spoken with the Pope and all of those things, what do you feel is the reception of your views at this point?
It depends where you are. So, for example, in Uganda right now, where the bishops are pretty quiet about the death penalty being imposed on LGBTQ people, in Ghana, they've actually sided with the government's anti-LGBTQ stance. In Poland, some of the bishops have said that LGBTQ people are a plague, right? And so in many places, not just my way of looking at things, but that openness and inclusion of LGBTQ people is really just, it's literally anathema to them. In other places, it's lukewarm. It's sort of like, well, we certainly don't want to kill them, and we certainly don't want them to be harmed, but well, they are sinful and they're going to hell and all this. And in other places, it's very open. People are very grateful. And I think, as you probably know, the litmus test is, do they know LGBTQ people? And especially, do they know them in their families? And that's where things change. And I think this is why the church is changing. And we are going through, this is also really inside Catholic baseball. We are going through what's called a synod, SYNOD. And the synod, the Worldwide Synod, is now meeting for a couple of years to see the sort of direction of the church. And one of the things that has come up in half of the documents worldwide, and is in the working document now, is LGBTQ issues, which is stunning to me. That would have never happened 10 years ago. So even the use of the word, was controversial 5-6 years ago. So it depends where you are. So it's very antipathetic in some places, almost violent, and in other places, very grateful. I live next door to a church run by another religious order called the Paulists, and they have one of the largest LGBTQ outreach programs in the world, really, for the Catholic Church. So, I go over there and they're very welcoming. But if I went to a church in Ghana and stood up and said, hey, let's pray for LGBTQ people, they'd probably kick me out of the church. There you go. That's the pluses and minuses of having a universal church.
Yeah. So staying on the idea of sinfulness for a minute, it always strikes me in any religious conversation, doesn't matter which kind, from what group, but if they have a concept of sin, it's always somebody else who's sinful.
Oh, totally.
Right? And I'm wondering, given particularly for the historical church, there is this sense of Jesus as having done something with sin, that we are all sinful, but there's something that happened with Jesus that changes our relationship with sin. It can be breaking the bonds, it can be removing sin, however you want to frame it. How do you think, in your experience, besides the I'm perfect, nobody else is, how do people kind of think about sin so that LGBTQ people are sinful, but they're okay, even if they've broken one of the 10, or 2 of the 10, or 5 of the 10? Do you know?
Yeah, or even if they're, well, that's a great question. I think a lot of it basically comes from homophobia. And one of the analogies I use, so in the Catholic world, birth control is still a sin. Using contraception is a sin. But 80% of married Catholic couples, this is married straight Catholic couples, have no problem with birth control, right? They might not use it, but they have no problem with it. Okay. That's a huge percentage. Now, no one says about married Catholic people, oh, they're all sinful, love the sinner, hate the sin. No one thinks about them that way. And yet, the LGBTQ person whose life might not be in complete conformity with Catholic teaching, everyone's like, oh, they're sinful. How can you talk to those people? So what's the difference? The difference is that we know, most Catholics know straight married couples, and they say, okay, I understand them. I understand their consciences. I understand that they're weighing things. And so that's one reason. One reason is people don't know LGBTQ people. That's changing, as much. And the second reason is I thought that, I've thought a long time about this, and I've talked to moral theologians. If you're a straight person, you might have to use contraception. And so you kind of reserve your judgment a little bit, but you think you'll never become gay, right? Assuming you're straight. So that's something that is a sin that you can condemn easily because you know that you'll never have to deal with that. But really, a lot of it's just homophobia. One of the things, I want to say is that I've been thinking about this a lot. When you drill down past political, sociological, ecclesiological, theological, even spiritual, what you often come down to is that some people are just mean. I mean, I know it's not the most profound theological question.
I'm glad to hear you say that.
Some people are just mean. You see mean people on Twitter, you see them in person, and it's like, playground bullies. And, they use religious, not everybody, of course, they use religious language and dogma and doctrine and thought and all that kind of stuff, really to kind of cover up. They just don't like gay people.
Yeah. So last summer, I taught a 16-week church history course about how we got here in the United States, like why our religious temperament is such as it is. But I started back, about a minute and a half after the resurrection, right?
You can't go too far back, right?
No, can't go too far back. We did allude to the fact that Jesus actually wasn't Christian himself. But one of the things that we talked about, particularly in the history of the United States, because I was focusing on that, is that as church denominations or flavors of church have developed, there is an exclusionary aspect pretty much no matter where you go. And so even when I'm thinking about when the Metropolitan Community Church was founded, Troy was not all about the women, right? So men were very comfortable and welcoming. Women were a little tougher for a while in the average MCC church. How do you think that exclusion works for us from a theological or personal or whatever?
That's a great story. Well, I'm sure you know the work of René Girard, who's the French philosopher. So he talks a lot about the need that communities have, kind of a primal need for scapegoats, first of all, to define themselves against the scapegoat. We are not them, right? We are us. And so I think you see a lot of that happening with this kind of moral panic around LGBTQ people, especially transgender people, right? It's just this kind of panic. The irony is that this is the opposite of what Jesus does. I thought I came up with this, but I think Greg Boyle came up with this. For Jesus, there's no us and them. There's just us. So whenever the disciples are tempted to see people as a them, Jesus kind of brings them in, whoever it is. Now, I know these analogies are difficult for people because a lot of times in the Gospels, it's always there's always the connection with sin. So no matter what the person is sort of excluded for, there's some sense of sin. But we can say that he reaches out to all sorts of people. He reaches out to the Roman centurion, the woman at the well, who's a Samaritan, people with leprosy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Gentiles, right, non-Jews. And he's about building an us, building a community. And yet, as you say, it is human nature to want to define ourselves against someone else. We are not them. I always think of, like the Monty Python, the Life of Brian, right? We're not the People's Front of Judea, we're the Judean People's Front, right? And everybody needs someone to kind of be against. But that's not Jesus's way. He is about breaking down those boundaries. He's about bringing the people who are outside inside, and also the people who are inside outside, right? So the disciples are meant to go out, literally. That's, as you know, apostle means to be sent out to other people. The Samaritan woman goes out to the Samaritan people, and that yet he brings in, restores people through healing and welcome and table fellowship, tax collectors and sinners, et cetera, et cetera. And even when one of the lines I love the best in one of the stories is the story of Zacchaeus. I'm happy when I'm talking to evangelicals, they know the Bible, and in that, which Catholics often do not. That's another thing about Catholics. You asked me to define them. In the story of Zacchaeus in Luke's gospel, as you know, when Jesus offers to come to Zacchaeus's house, who is on the outs because he's a tax collector and he would have been seen as colluding with the Romans and skimming money off the top, etc. All who saw it began to grumble. It's one of my favorite lines. People, even back then, he's on the outs. Even back then, people grumbled. And I'll tell you something quick, and then I'll shut up. My New Testament professor told me that the Greek used panta, all, meant the disciples too. So all who saw it began to grumble means the disciples didn't like it. Jesus is right in front of them. So I guess it's not surprising.
Not too surprising, no.
Yeah.
I was thinking as you were talking, if Matthew has one of the underlying themes of Matthew is the conflict of kingdoms, it seems to me that one of the underlying themes of Luke, I'm glad you brought up Luke, is that healing also restores to community. So you see all of these symbolic restoring to communities throughout Luke.
I love that. That's really great. And it's like the Gerasene demoniac in the Synoptics. He is restored to himself. He is in his right mind, and he's back in the community. He's clothed. He's And there's a guy who's totally on the outs, and people are afraid of him. Anyway, we could go on, but I agree. I like Battle of the Kingdoms too. I've never heard it put that way. That's really great.
Yeah, it's really kind of an interesting theme when you chase it down. So let's divert just a little bit. So can you describe Jesuit spirituality or your own spirituality, but what that means for you? What does that look like for you?
It's actually pretty easy. And Jesuit spirituality is my spirituality. I wouldn't say vice versa. My spirituality is Jesuit. L'état c'est moi. So it is finding God in all things. That usually like the kind of whatever 2-cent phrase is like doesn't encapsulate it, but this one actually does. Finding God in all things. That means that God is to be found not only in our prayer, in the sacraments, in worship, in reading the Bible, in doing Christian charitable works, but in relationships, in nature, in podcasts, in music, in family, right, in work, right? So it is a spirituality that encourages people to look for God's presence in every moment of the day. So I think that's the best way to appreciate it, and that goes back to the earliest Jesuits, finding God in all things. The other one is being, now neither of these are sort of original to the Jesuits, but I think we are sort of popularizing them, or we're identified with them. The other one is being a contemplative in action. So what does that mean? That means that we have a contemplative stance in the world, in an active life, which is what most people are living. So those are the two things: finding God in all things and being a contemplative in action, I think, are ways of understanding Jesuit spirituality. There are certain ways that we have of prayer, which is imagining yourself in a scripture scene, kind of picturing yourself there and seeing what comes up. But that's more kind of how to pray. But our spirituality, finding God in all things. And that's why Jesuits do all sorts of, things that seem, like working with gang members, prison ministry, refugees. God's there. It's not just about, as important as it is, it's not just about being in the parish and saying mass.
Absolutely. We talk spiritual disciplines a lot. And so when I am teaching Bible, one of the first things we do is learn how to do Lectio Divina, right?
Oh,
so that people can have that practice going. Can you talk a little bit about how you practice seeing God in all things? Because that's not a natural kind of, the material is a very strong thing, right?
Yeah.
So seeing beyond that's important. How do you do that?
Well, there's a couple ways. One of the most important ways is a prayer that we call the Examen, Examen. It's from the Spanish because Ignatius spoke Spanish. It's sometimes called the examination of conscience, which isn't the best name because it has kind of like moralistic tones. Some people call it the examination of consciousness. I don't like that either because it's like, am I awake or am I not awake? But it basically is reviewing the day to see where you experience God's presence. So you start with gratitude. You call to mind the things you're grateful for, just simple things, right? You thank God for them. And then you review the day, start to finish, and look for places and what does that mean? Where you felt moved, right? Where you felt God's hand, where you also moved away from God, where you might have felt the Spirit kind of calling you to do something, where you're grateful for something, kind of an intervention or some sort of interaction with somebody. Even something, I had a great meal last night. I mean, something, really simple. Then you ask for sorrow for your sins, because, none of us are perfect. And then you ask for the grace for the next day. So basically what happens is when you do the exam, you start to notice. It's a prayer about noticing where God is. And then the next day, when something happens, you're like, oh, this is something I'm going to be remembering in my exam. And this is one way of sort of being attentive. I think, not every single moment of the day. I think the saints may have been like this, Jesus or Mary. Obviously Jesus was, completely attentive to God's presence, but there you can practice it and train yourself to notice. So I'll take something crazy. The other day, not too crazy. The other day I was walking down the street. There's a homeless guy who basically lives on our sidewalk. I give him money, of course, but the other day I'm not very good with names, and I always want to ask him his name. So I said, "By the way, what's your name?" And he said, "Angel." My name's Angel. So I just thought, wow, now you could deal with that one of two ways. Well, many ways. You could say, oh, that's interesting. What an interesting coincidence, and kind of walk on, Or you could really kind of pause and say, wow, what does that mean? What is God revealing to me there? So I think that's the difference, kind of looking at that as a moment of encounter with God, which it certainly was.
I like that when you were talking about the exam, and I love that you were talking in terms of examination, but not condemnation, right? So when we feel distant from God, that doesn't mean we're necessarily doing something wrong. It means we are being inattentive, right?
Yeah. I have a friend who says, I love this friend of mine who says, if you feel distant from God, guess who moved?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's us not being attentive, right? God's always there. I think a lot of listeners will say, well, how come, God isn't just more present or visible? And I do a lot of spiritual direction. People come to me, and I sometimes think that too, like, come on, like, just make yourself known a little bit more. Give me a little help. But the examine helps you to notice those places where God's presence is subtle. It's like the still small voice, right, in the Old Testament. It's pretty subtle sometimes. Now that bothers me, actually, I should say, as a believer. I really wish it were a little clearer. But I'm sure Jesus would say, hey, it was clear. I was clear back in Galilee,
Yeah, exactly. If you follow me, which means actually paying attention to me,
Exactly.
It'll be clear, right?
Exactly.
Right. You've been talking about the Jesuit distinctives of spirituality, which is fantastic. What other practices have you had over the years? It doesn't have to be something you're doing now, that's been powerful for you. I'm thinking, for example, besides the examine, one of our listeners was praying Merton's prayer every day.
Oh, great.
Just that kind of, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I trust that you're with me, and
prayer.
It's a great prayer. Do you have anything like that?
Actually, yeah, two things I'd point to. One, the other way that we are known for praying is, I mentioned it earlier, imagining yourself in a scripture scene. So that's the way I pray the most. We do the examine at night, but in the morning, what does that mean? It means literally picturing yourself in the scene and then seeing what comes up and trusting that this is one way that God has of communicating with you. Now, that doesn't mean that every single thing that pops in your mind is from God, but it does mean that, our imagination is a gift from God. And if we picture ourselves in these scripture scenes, literally, what do I see? Or what do I hear? What do I taste? What do I feel? What do I touch? What do I smell? Right? If you can imagine that, some things can really surprise you. And you can say, wow, I never noticed that about that gospel passage. And you might be moved to do something, or you might have some desire. You might have a memory. I talk about this in my book, Learning to Pray. You might have a feeling of just peace. A lot of times it's emotion. I'm feeling calm, or I'm feeling angry about something. And then the other thing is I go on, like all Jesuits do, an 8-day retreat every year, 8-day silent retreat, where we do that kind of prayer. for 8 days. And it's great. It's really the time that I feel the most connected to Jesus, and the time where those prayers are the most fruitful, where you really say, oh boy, okay, that's interesting. Day to day, it's a little hard to get in that space. So that's why I find retreats really helpful. So yeah, so what we call Ignatian contemplation, and then doing it on retreat every year. That's essential for me.
When I go on silent retreats, what I've told people is that usually once I get there and I've gotten settled, I'm fine for about an hour. And then I start getting really antsy, like really just kind of frantic. And usually there's crying somewhere involved, but it takes me kind of that first falling apartness before I can get into the more of a contemplative awareness. It's like everything in me has to just explode. And then it can go, okay, now what are we doing?
Well, that's great. It's funny. My experience is somewhat similar. I always say that I'm like 8 days. The first day is like, oh, I'm so happy on retreat. This is so beautiful. I love this. This is amazing. The second day is like, oh, these gospel passages are going to be amazing. I love praying with them. Third day, it's like, oh, here comes this problem. Here comes whatever it is that God wants to deal with. Fourth and fifth day are like kind of wrestling with it, in prayer. What does that mean? That means literally like kind of seeing what comes up and what you notice in these experiences and then these gospel passages. Usually sixth day, that's the crying and the breakthrough. And then seventh day, I'm like, okay, time to go home. That's the part that I feel really selfish about, because it's like, okay, I got what I want, right? And I got my big breakthrough. But I also think the other thing that happens is you really have to let go, as you know, of your desire to kind of control where the retreat's going to go, right? Like, I want to talk about this, and God may want to focus you on something else. And then the other thing is you have to let go of as Merton says, the hope of results, like kind of manufacturing something. That's hard too. Our joke in the Jesuits is alluding to what you said. How was your retreat? Good. Well, did you cry? Like, because if you didn't cry, doesn't count. That's our joke.
I like that about our tendency to want to direct the retreat
rather
than see where God is taking us. One of our podcast episodes is about spiritual competitiveness.
Oh, yeah.
I was talking about how I'm the only person I know who can meditate competitively. So I'll be sitting with people in a room and I'll be thinking about, well, how well am I doing this in comparison to Joe across the, it's ridiculous. But that desire to both see yourself as better, but also just on a simple, there's my goal. I have to have a goal. The goal is,
that's a great spiritual competitiveness. I sometimes say people also get into the trap of like, they need to produce, they need to have results, they need to do it. And, of course, it's God doing it within you. And that's really, it's very dangerous. Sometimes the retreat or your prayer feels kind of dry. And it's not because you've failed. It's just because for whatever reason, the grace has not been given you in that particular moment. But yeah, my first novice director used to say, you're a human being, not a human doing. It's not about producing. The other thing I have to say, I do find spiritual competitiveness actually moves people away from the spiritual life, because what happens is, this is my experience, people will say with the best of intentions, oh, my prayer is the most important thing. Every day I feel God's presence, or, oh, that retreat was life-changing, and never have I felt God's hand on me as much. And what it does is it makes people feel, well, gosh, there's something wrong with me. Right. I talk a lot about this in the Learning to Pray book, that it distances people because they think, well, what about my prayer life? It's that, sometimes it's pretty dry. And yeah, that kind of comparison is really dangerous, because, God deals with us in different ways. And the way that God deals with you is great. And that doesn't mean that that's the way that God has to deal with me. It's very personal. Can I tell you a quick story?
Of course.
So I lead pilgrimages to the Holy Land. One of the things I love is at the end of the day, we do faith sharing, where everybody talks about something that happened to them, something meaningful or significant. And I love this story. And this is not made up. People will always say, oh my gosh, I saw the sunrise in the Sea of Galilee and I was moved to tears when I realized that Jesus saw this. And another person will say, yeah, I saw that sunrise and I was just kind of tired. Another person will say, oh my gosh, I was in the church of the Nativity, and when I thought that this is where Jesus was born, I just was overwhelmed. And another person will say, yeah, that church was too noisy. I hated that church. Another person will say, boy, when I heard that hymn, Lord, you have come to the seashore, and we were in the Sea of Galilee, I just realized like that all started here. And it just changed everything for me. And another person will say, I hate that hymn. They sing it in the church. I can't stand it. So what's the point? I always say to people, God leads people in different ways, and yet it's the same spirit. That's the irony.
Yes.
I love that you don't have to like the Church of the Nativity or that song or be moved to tears at a sunset or a sunrise. You don't have to, because this may not be the way God's working with you, and that's okay. That can really free a lot of people up. That is one of the most freeing things, to say that God is dealing with you the way God deals with you, and you don't have to compare it. It's not better or worse. It's just you. It's okay. I mean, you might love a song moves you to tears, and you play for someone, they're like, yeah, okay. Whatever, right?
Yeah.
It makes me think of monastic chanting. Like, I love monastic chanting when it's discordant and sloppy and all, just like when you were actually around people who are actually doing this because they have to pray the Psalms every week, But I know that there are people who hear chanting of any kind and are just like, oh my God, get me out of here, but it's just a very
and
thing.
it's like, fine, that doesn't have to be for everybody. Of course, if you're in the monastery, hopefully that you actually like it.
That's one of those, that's where you're wrestling with your soul, is trying to learn to like it. So let's tangent to your books. So you are not just a contemplative in action in the world, you're also a contemplative in writing. And we are both writers of one kind or another. And writing is hard work. It's painful, it's slow, it's lonely, and you're lucky if anything comes out that you're happy about. So, given that writing is hard work and that one of your callings is to writing, what have you discovered in your writing that has been interesting to you?
Sometimes I don't know what I'm going to say until I sit down and start writing. That's one thing. I do know that about myself. I may disappoint you here. I hate to disappoint you. I actually enjoy writing.
Good.
I enjoy. Now, here's why. I think this is one of the reasons why. First of all, I don't have to make a living on it, because I take a vow of poverty, so it all goes to the Jesuits. So if one book is not successful, that's okay. On to the next one. So there's not as much pressure. Second, I don't really have things I have to write about. So my book on Lazarus, which I just finished, I wanted to do that. So it was kind of fun. I guess the hard part for me is like the footnotes and all that, checking. I do hate that stuff. But one of the things I've learned is that I know this sounds crazy, but that I can't really write if I'm not in a good mood. I know that sounds crazy, but if I'm in a bad mood, I mean, I can. But my best writing is when I'm really, happy and hopeful. And so I'm writing a book now. It's a memoir, and I need to be kind of in the right space. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. But the Lazarus book, I loved it. I love spending time on Lazarus. I love that. That's my favorite gospel story. My mother said 400 pages about Lazarus. How's that possible? But sometimes, so I have a lot to say. Sometimes, I don't know what I'm going to say until I sit down and really kind of have to think it out,
I love that. So for our folks who are kind of new to so many of them grew up in evangelicalism, that was their framing paradigm, if you will. And as they start to get to know people like you, or people like my friend John, whom we interviewed before, or anybody who's got a different paradigm they're coming out of, it expands their worlds tremendously. So I'm wondering, is there one of your books or one of your writings for the magazine or any of those things that you might recommend as here's another way to think about this that you might not have thought about?
Definitely, because I have a friend who's one of my spiritual directees who is he's an evangelical. I don't want to say former, he's an evangelical. And the biggest surprise for him was, now this is from him, so this is not me kind of trying to characterize evangelicals. He said that the idea of sort of encountering God in your prayer and trusting what's going on in your experience was new for him. And so the idea that, God would be accessible through your prayer, and that you would be able to meet Jesus in a particular way, and that it wasn't extrinsic. It wasn't someone saying, this is what, the Bible tells you, that it is a kind of personal experience. That was new for him. And that was a surprise to me too. to hear him say that. So the book Learning to Pray, I think, would be very helpful for people. It's how we Jesuits pray. And it's trusting your experience of God. I mean, that's what it comes down to, that your experience of God, the kind of stuff we were just talking about before, is meaningful. And that it is okay that it's not the same as everybody else's. So that I've learned from him. That's what he was saying that he learned as an evangelical.
That's great. Can you tell us a little bit about the new book, title, all of that stuff?
Super excited. So the book is called Come Forth, which is what Jesus says to Lazarus. Now, since a lot of the LGBTQ people are here and they're all also Bible literate, as you know, in the New Revised Standard Version, the actual translation of what Jesus says to Lazarus, which I think in the Greek is "douro exo," is translated as "come out," which is what he says to the demons too. So it's "come out." The fourth, there's no sort of direction implied. But I said to my publisher, I cannot call, after I've just done all this LGBT stuff, I cannot call a book "Come Out,"
Right.
about Lazarus, because people are going to think it's a book on LGBT stuff. So I'm calling it "Come Forth." It is a look at the. I know it's funny.
I love that. Just made me very happy.
I know.
Good.
I talk about that in the book too. So it is called
good.
"Come Forth." My agent was very funny. He said it's like a sequel to "Come First," "Come Second," "Come Third," and "Come Fourth." So it is a deep dive into the Lazarus story. And so it's a lot of biblical exegesis. I think your listeners would like that part in particular. A lot of sort of reflections on the spirituality of the story. So what does each part of the story tell us? A lot of stuff on Lazarus in culture and art, right? Lazarus popping up in movies and films and paintings and poems and plays. And then a lot about the real life setting. So what is it like now in Bethany today? I love this. The name of so Bethany is still there. Have you been to the Holy Land by any chance? Or
I have not.
So one day you will go and you will see that Bethany, which I love, is in Palestinian territory. And the name of the town in Arabic today is Al-Azariya, which means the place of Lazarus.
Okay, that's incredible. Awesome.
Yeah, it is awesome. And so I talk about Al-Azariya and the Church of Lazarus, and where they think that you can visit the tomb, what is supposed to be the tomb, and just what that's like there. So it's just looking at the theme of the book is Jesus calls us all to new life, and he calls us all to new life by asking us, like Lazarus, to leave certain things behind in the tomb, to let certain things die. And what do you call it to let die, in order that you can hear Jesus's voice inviting you to come forth into the light? So that's the kind of theme of the book. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It has pictures too.
Wow. Are these authentic pictures from? I'm just kidding.
They're actually photographs of Lazarus.
That's right.
They are images of Lazarus from all sorts of different, cultural, film, TV, blah, 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 art. But then also pictures of the tomb today and Al-Azariya and what does Bethany look like today? It's still there. It's still in the same place that Jesus visited. It was, right? Yeah. So
that's awesome. Is there anything you would like to share that we haven't talked about, that's been on your mind, that you've never said, you've said 1,000 times, just anything that is on your heart and mind?
Yeah, I'd like to say that for as much as people might know me for the LGBTQ stuff, that my ministry is a lot broader. I'm not diminishing the LGBTQ stuff, but I've written books about Jesus, about the saints, about prayer, about Lazarus, and so I do find it funny that people think that they see one of my books on prayer and they say, "Oh, I didn't know you write about that." And I was like, "I actually write more about that stuff." And I also think that those things go hand in hand. So the reason I work with LGBTQ people is that I follow Jesus and I want to be with people who feel like they're excluded. And that the reason I love the Lazarus story, one of the reasons, is that it does speak to everybody, including LGBTQ people, for whom coming out is a big deal. So it's all together. It's all of a piece. So I guess that's what I'd like to say. And I also want to say thanks. You are a great interviewer and you ask great questions. So thanks for that. You have a lovely voice too, if I'm allowed to say that.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Yeah,
well, I will say in closing here, before I say thank you, that I actually knew who you were before all the LGBTQ stuff, because I feel very privileged right now. I'm like, yeah, of course, this is Father James Martin. What are you talking about?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending time with us. I know that you're an incredibly busy person, and it means so much that you took the time to do this. We're really
My
grateful.
total pleasure, and great
Thank
to be
you.
with you. God bless you.
And that was Elane's chat with Father James Martin, Jesuit priest, best-selling author. Jim's latest book is called Building a Bridge: How the Catholic Church and the LGBT Community Can Enter into a Relationship of Respect, Compassion, and Sensitivity. You can find it anywhere, everywhere. Please go check it out. And also, of course, his new book on Lazarus will be coming out very soon. He is the editor-in-chief of America, the Jesuit Review, which is a magazine that you can find online at americamagazine.org. We love that you guys are listening. We hope that you will reach out if you have questions or ideas for episodes. You can find us at cocktailtheology.com. We have new episodes every Thursday. Until next time, bye-bye.